Shalom, I'm Rabbi Gail Schuster-Buskila, and today I'd like to talk to you about the third Torah portion in the book of Exodus, called Parashat Bo. And in this Torah portion, we're going to deal with pretty serious topics, tyranny, slavery, and of course, the beginning of the journey of the children of Israel from tyranny, slavery to freedom. These are the topics that I used to talk about when I was a child in the new Haggadah that was put out in the middle of the 20th century in the United States by the Reconstructionist movement and Mordechai Kaplan. I do like the back of it as well. And I hope you get involved in this, because these are some of the most important topics that we can discuss in the Torah. They are difficult and yet fascinating accounts of things that one wouldn't expect any people to put in their history. The fact that we were slaves, and even if it's a myth, it's an awfully interesting myth. Even if it's just a story, it touches all of us even today. I wish I could say that there was an end to tyranny. I wish I could say that there was an end to slavery in the 21st century. And I certainly wish that everyone were going to experience freedom, as the story of the exodus of the children of Israel from Egypt. So let's look at some of the interesting parts of this parasha. As you see, I've titled my video for today on tyranny and freedom. It comes from Parashat Bo, which is in the book of Exodus, beginning in chapter 10. Before I really look at my Midrash, I want to talk about a few ideas that struck me while I was writing this Midrash. This picture to the right is a picture from the New Haggadah 1941, and it is obviously of someone who is enslaved. A short paragraph, and this was written in 1941, but the cover you see here is the cover of the revised edition by Mordechai Kaplan in 1978. Which is the picture that the book I just showed you. This is the picture of it. Pharaoh, arch tyrant. The Pharaoh of the Pesach story was not just a cruel king who happened to live at a certain time in a certain country. The Pharaoh about whom we read in the Bible is, of course, such a king, but the Pharaoh that our ancestors pictured each and every year for century after century, when Pesach was celebrated, was more than one man. He was for them every tyrant, every cruel and heartless ruler who ever enslaved the men, women, and children of his country. For our forefathers, Pharaoh was the symbol of all tyrants who ever acted as though they were gods and whose will had to be obeyed without question on penalty of torture or death. These words were originally published in 1941, and sadly, they still seem to be relevant today. I'd like to go to one more quote before I deal with my Midrash from one of my favorite authors, Toni Morrison, who in 1995 gave a speech about racism and fascism. And this really applies to the whole beginning of the story of how Pharaoh treated the children of Israel in the book of Exodus. Let us be reminded that before there is a final solution, there must be a first solution, a second one, and even a third. The move toward a final solution is not a jump. It takes one step, and then another, then another. Before I get to my Midrash, I'd like to show you the beginning of Parashat Bo, on the wonderful website Safaria that puts the Hebrew next to the English. I'd like to remind you also of one other idea, this discussion between Moses and Yahweh, Yud He Vav He, which in English here is translated as the Lord. I don't use this particular translation. I actually use the letters YHWH to represent this. And I think that it is an interesting interchange. And of course, it deals with the problem of why Pharaoh would not release the children of Israel. I am showing you my Midrash from my website, Midrash.Harabah. And you can see here that I've entitled this to release us all. This, in some ways, is not just those slaves from the Torah, from the book of Exodus, but it may represent generations, a millennium full of slaves, and sadly, possibly even those today. I'd like to read from the third verse of Exodus 10. Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh. They spoke to him, saying, "So said Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews, how long will you refuse to submit to me? Release my people so they can worship me." My Midrash begins, and this is the voice from a slave. How long can we do all this? There is so much. It never ends. My mother suffered every day, and I suffered as she did. Will my children always feel our burden? How can I bear to work and see them suffer? How did my mother bear it? She did not. It killed her spirit and then her body. She used to sing to me, but now the tune has faded from my memory. When will I have the strength to sing to my children? All I can do is to cry for an end to this pain and degradation. Release me, release us. It comes from the sympathy that I have for the plight of people who do not have control of their own destiny. I continue with verse 9 of Exodus 10. Moses said, "We will go with our young and our elders. We will with our sons and with our daughters, with our sheep and with our cattle, because it is a holy day of Yahweh for us." The Midrash that I wrote continues, how will we go? How will we go, we sons and daughters of slaves? If the day of our redemption ever comes, we will stand and cheer, even if it means that we march out into the desert. That day will wrap around us and carry us to a strange place. We cried and wailed for so long, but we will rejoice then and sing. There's much more to my Midrash, but I'm going to point out the verse that I quoted from Isaiah at the end, and the video that I put after my Midrash, which is the translation of verse 2. Here, God is my salvation. I will trust and not be afraid. We don't know where our strength will come from when we have to overcome difficulties. And in Isaiah's mind, it did come from God. I'm not sure about individual salvation, and the word salvation is a very difficult and complicated concept. But in Parashat Bo and here in Isaiah, we are talking about something that is not just personal, but is collective as well. It's not just that we ourselves will be saved, or whatever that really means, but that when we have release, when we get release, we may have worked hard, but from some inner strength in general, people that have struggled, kinds of difficult struggles that we read about here in the Bible, and that wherever it be in the world, it doesn't really matter today, the 18th century, 19th century, and I wish it were not going to be in the future. But some sort of overcoming of this struggle it has an interesting and fascinating force. Some of us call that God. And this beautiful video, and I will leave a link to this video, which I put here at the end of my Midrash, there'll also be a link to the Midrash, is a personal spiritual expression of how I seem to feel about this whole parasha. It's a deeply moving experience, and I believe this rendition, Hine El Yeshuati, which is the prayer said when we sing the Havdalah, which is the separation between the Sabbath day and the weekday prayers on a Saturday after sundown, I think is a parallel to the feeling that I had when I wrote this Midrash. I hope you enjoy it. I really feel very close to this parasha because I know there are so many people who are still in need of freedom from tyranny. And I hope you all have a thoughtful and interesting Shabbat, Parashat Bo. Shabbat Shalom.